Admiral Kresh stood on the bridge of his flagship watching the screens with growing horror. The mechanical swarm had reached the outer colonies of his empire, and nothing could stop them. These machines, called devourers, had been eating planets for thousands of years across the galaxy. They turned everything into more of themselves and grew stronger with each world they consumed. The Zephyrian Empire had ruled 12 star systems for over 2,000 years. They were proud warriors with advanced technology and powerful ships. Their ancestors had conquered many worlds and built a civilization that other species respected. But now they faced something that made all their achievements meaningless. Captain Jake Morrison sat in his chair aboard the Earth ship UES Vengeance, reading the message that had just arrived. The translation software worked hard to convert the alien words into something humans could understand. The message was simple, but desperate. An alien empire was dying, and they needed help from anyone who would listen. The Zephyrians had already lost 3 colony worlds to the Devourers. Each planet had billions of inhabitants who were now gone. The machines did not kill in the way most species understood killing. They simply broke everything down into basic materials and used those materials to build more machines. It was efficient and completely without mercy. Morrison looked at the tactical display showing what little information Earth had about the Zephyrian Empire. They were located about 50 light-years away from human space. The journey would take 5 days using the newest human hyperspace engines. Most other species would need weeks or months to make the same trip. The communication officer, Tony Harris, turned in his seat to face Morrison. The message from the Zephyrians was being broadcast to every known civilization in the galaxy. They were asking for military aid, medical supplies, refugee ships, or anything else that might help. The tone of the message made it clear they expected very little response. Morrison had read the files about these devourers before. Earth intelligence services had been tracking reports about them for decades. They appeared every few centuries in different parts of the galaxy. They would consume everything in their path until they ran out of materials, then go dormant until something woke them up again. This time, they had awakened in Zephyrian space. The tactical officer, Lisa Grant, pulled up more data on her screen. According to galactic records, the Devourers had destroyed at least 40 civilizations over the past 10,000 years. Some of those civilizations had been much more advanced than either humans or Zephyrians. The machines seemed to learn from each encounter and become harder to fight. Chief Engineer Rick Campbell was already running calculations on his systems. The Vengeance was one of only 3 ships in the human fleet equipped with the new experimental weapons. These weapons had never been tested in real combat, but the simulations showed promising results. Campbell believed they might actually work against the Devourers. Morrison made his decision quickly. He opened a communication channel to Earth Command and requested permission to respond to the Zephyrian distress call. The response came back within an hour. Earth Command authorized the mission, but with strict instructions. They were to assess the situation and provide what aid they could without risking the ship or revealing too much about human capabilities. The medical officer, Dr. Kate Miller, began preparing the ship for combat operations. She had studied alien biology for years, but had never treated Zephyrian injuries before. Her medical bay was equipped with the most advanced healing technology Earth could produce. She hoped it would be enough if there were survivors to treat. Navigation Officer Steve Collins plotted the course to Zephyrian space. The route would take them through several uninhabited systems where they could make final preparations. Collins had been studying alien navigation techniques and believed he could get them there faster than the Zephyrians expected. The weapons specialist Amy Parker ran final checks on all systems. The Vengeance carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon, but the Devourers were unlike any enemy humans had faced before. They could adapt to most weapons and seemed to have no weak points that conventional tactics could exploit. Security Chief Ryan Bell reviewed the personnel files of everyone aboard. The crew of the Vengeance included some of the best-trained soldiers and technicians in the human military. They had trained for years for missions like this, but none of them had ever faced an enemy like the Devourers. Morrison called a meeting of his senior staff to discuss their options. The briefing room filled with quiet tension as everyone considered what they were about to attempt. The Zephyrians had described losing hundreds of ships to the Devourers without causing any significant damage. Yet Earth Command expected them to make a difference with just one ship. The communications officer, Harris, reported that several other species had responded to the Zephyrian distress call. Most were offering refugee assistance or medical supplies. A few smaller civilizations were sending small military forces, but nothing that seemed likely to change the outcome of the battle. Morrison looked around the room at his officers. These people had served with him for 3 years, and he trusted them completely. They had faced pirates, hostile aliens, and natural disasters together. This mission would test everything they had learned and everything Earth had taught them about warfare. The ship began its journey toward Zephyrian space, with Morrison wondering if they were sailing toward their deaths or toward the greatest victory in human history. The UES Vengeance moved through hyperspace toward Zephyrian territory, while the crew prepared for what might be their final mission. Morrison spent most of his time studying everything Earth intelligence had gathered about the Devourers over the years. The reports made for grim reading, but they also revealed patterns that might be useful. Chief Engineer Campbell worked around the clock with his team to optimize the ship's experimental weapons systems. The gravity manipulation cannon had never been fired at full power, and the exotic matter injectors were still largely theoretical. Campbell knew they would only get one chance to use these weapons effectively. Dr. Miller prepared her medical bay for casualties, but also studied Zephyrian physiology from the databases. The aliens were larger than humans with tougher skin and different blood chemistry. Her equipment could probably keep them alive, but healing their injuries would require some improvisation. Navigator Collins fine-tuned their approach vector to Zephyrian space. He had been analyzing the pattern of Devourer attacks and believed he knew where the main swarm would be located. Getting there quickly might give them some tactical advantage. The weapons officer Parker ran constant simulations of combat scenarios against the Devourers. Each simulation ended badly for conventional tactics, but the new weapons showed some promise. Parker began developing firing solutions that would maximize their chances of success. Security Chief Bell drilled his teams on boarding procedures and close combat tactics. If the Devourers managed to get aboard the Vengeance, the crew would need to fight them hand-to-hand. Bell made sure every person on the ship knew how to use the new plasma rifles designed specifically for fighting mechanical enemies. Communications. Officer Harris monitored galactic communications to track the progress of the Devourer attack. The reports from Zephyrian space grew worse each day. The fourth colony world had fallen, and the machines were moving toward the core systems of the Empire. Morrison called daily briefings to keep everyone informed about their mission status. The crew of the Vengeance numbered just over 800 people, but they were all volunteers who had specifically requested assignment to experimental weapon ships. They knew the risks and had accepted them. The tactical officer Grant spent her time analyzing Devourer movement patterns and communication methods. The machines seemed to coordinate their attacks with perfect efficiency, but Grant thought she detected some weaknesses in their formation flying. She began working on tactical plans that might exploit these weaknesses. On the third day of their journey, the Vengeance received another message from the Zephyrians. Admiral Kresh himself was requesting that all responding ships coordinate their arrival times and battle plans. The message included detailed tactical data about Devourer capabilities and weaknesses that the Zephyrians had discovered through bitter experience. Morrison studied the Zephyrian tactical data with growing concern. The aliens had tried every conventional weapon and tactic without success. Energy weapons were absorbed by the Devourers and used to power their own systems. Kinetic weapons caused some damage, but the machines could repair themselves faster than they could be destroyed. Campbell made modifications to the ship's power systems based on the Zephyrian data. If energy weapons only made the Devourers stronger, then the Vengeance would need to be very careful about how it used its own power. Campbell began developing tactics that would minimize energy emissions while maximizing kinetic impact. The crew practiced emergency procedures daily as they approached their destination. Everyone knew that fighting the Devourers would be unlike any previous human military engagement. The machines did not negotiate, retreat, or show mercy. They simply consumed everything in their path until nothing remained. Dr. Miller received additional medical data from the Zephyrians about their wounded soldiers. The Devourers did not just destroy ships and buildings. They also attacked living beings directly by breaking down their cellular structure. Miller began developing treatments for this type of injury, even though she had never seen anything like it before. Parker finished her analysis of the new weapons systems and presented her findings to Morrison. The gravity cannon could potentially create small black holes that would destroy anything they touched. The exotic matter injectors could destabilize atomic bonds across large areas. Both weapons were incredibly dangerous and had never been tested in combat. Collins reported that they would reach Zephyrian space in 2 more days. The navigation computers showed that they were making better time than expected thanks to favorable hyperspace conditions. This would give them more time to observe the enemy before engaging in combat. Harris intercepted communications from other species responding to the Zephyrian distress call. Most were sending supply ships or medical vessels. Only a few civilizations were sending military forces, and those forces were small. The galactic community seemed to have given up hope of actually defeating the Devourers. Morrison realized that the Vengeance might be the only real military response to the Zephyrian crisis. Other species saw this as a humanitarian mission to evacuate survivors. Only humans seemed to think they could actually fight the Devourers and win. Grant completed her tactical analysis and presented several battle plans to Morrison. Each plan involved using the ship's speed and maneuverability to avoid direct confrontation while striking at key points in the Devourer formation. Grant believed they could cause significant damage before the machines could adapt to their tactics. Bell finished training the crew on anti-boarding procedures and reported that everyone was ready for combat. The ship carried enough small arms and armor to equip a small army. Bell hoped they would not need to use them, but he wanted everyone prepared for the worst-case scenario. Campbell ran final tests on all systems and declared the ship ready for battle. The experimental weapons were functioning perfectly, and the ship's defenses were operating at peak efficiency. Campbell estimated they had enough power and ammunition for one major engagement against the Devourers. Morrison looked at the tactical displays showing their approach to Zephyrian space and wondered what they would find when they arrived. The UES Vengeance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Zephyrian territory and immediately began scanning the system ahead. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. The Devourer swarm had consumed 5 colony worlds and was now approaching the main Zephyrian homeworld. Billions of mechanical units moved through space in perfect formation, consuming everything in their path. Admiral Kresh watched his sensors in disbelief as the human ship appeared on his displays. The vessel was massive beyond anything he had expected from such a young civilization. The Vengeance measured nearly 3 kilometers in length and bristled with weapon systems that Zephyrian technology could not identify. Morrison stood on his bridge, studying the tactical displays that showed the full scope of the Devourer threat. The mechanical swarm stretched across an entire star system with concentrations of machines numbering in the billions. Each individual unit was about the size of a small fighter craft, but they moved with collective intelligence that made them far more dangerous. Chief Engineer Campbell reported that all systems were operating normally and the experimental weapons were fully charged. The gravity manipulation cannon was drawing power directly from the ship's fusion reactors, while the exotic matter injectors were primed and ready for deployment. Campbell had never been more nervous about firing weapons in his entire career. The communications officer Harris established contact with Admiral Kresh and the surviving Zephyrian fleet. The alien commander's first words were a warning for the humans to flee while they still could. Kresh explained that his fleet of 800 ships had been reduced to fewer than 200 in just 5 days of fighting. Tactical Officer Grant analyzed the Devourer formations and confirmed what the Zephyrians had reported. The machines moved with perfect coordination and seemed to anticipate every attack before it happened. They had adapted to every weapon the Zephyrians used and developed countermeasures faster than the aliens could change their tactics. Dr. Miller prepared her medical bay for potential casualties while monitoring the communications from Zephyrian hospital ships. The reports of injuries caused by Devourer attacks were unlike anything in human medical experience. The machines seemed to break down living tissue at the molecular level, causing injuries that were almost impossible to treat. Navigator Collins calculated approach vectors that would allow the Vengeance to engage the Devourers without getting trapped in the middle of the swarm. The machines had surrounded several Zephyrian positions and were systematically destroying them. Collins needed to find a way to strike without becoming surrounded himself. Weapons Officer Parker reviewed her, firing solutions one final time and made minor adjustments based on the real-time tactical data. The gravity cannon required precise targeting to be effective, while the exotic matter injectors needed to be deployed at exactly the right moment to cause maximum damage to the Devourer swarm. Security Chief Bell deployed his teams to defensive positions throughout the ship and activated all internal security systems. If the Devourers managed to breach the hull, his people would need to fight them in the corridors and compartments of the ship. Bell hoped it would not come to that, but he was prepared for anything. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kresh and requested detailed information about Devourer tactics and capabilities. The Zephyrian commander provided everything. His people had learned during 5 days of desperate fighting. The information was valuable but also deeply troubling. The Devourers seemed to learn from every encounter and adapt their tactics accordingly. They had started the battle using simple swarm tactics, but had quickly developed more sophisticated strategies. They now used coordinated attacks that overwhelmed Zephyrian defenses and cut off escape routes for damaged ships. Campbell monitored the ship's power systems as they approached the edge of the battle zone. The Vengeance was running silent to avoid detection, but the experimental weapons required enormous amounts of power. Campbell would need to bring the reactors to full power at exactly the right moment to achieve maximum effectiveness. Grant identified what appeared to be command nodes within the Devourer swarm. These larger machines seemed to coordinate the actions of smaller units and might be vulnerable to targeted attacks. Grant began developing firing solutions that would take out these command nodes first. Harris intercepted Devourer communications and was surprised to discover that the machines were actually trying to communicate with the humans. The mechanical intelligence seemed curious about this new species that had arrived in the battle zone. Harris reported that the Devourers were analyzing human technology through their transmissions. Morrison realized that the Devourers were studying them just as intensively as they were studying the machines. Any delay would give the enemy time to develop countermeasures against human weapons. Morrison decided to attack immediately before the machines could adapt to their presence. Parker reported that all weapons were ready and targeting solutions were locked in. The gravity cannon was aimed at the largest concentration of Devourers, while the exotic matter injectors were prepared to create a chain reaction that would spread throughout the enemy formation. Collins positioned the ship for maximum tactical advantage while maintaining escape routes in case the attack failed. The Vengeance would have only minutes to inflict maximum damage before the Devourers could respond to their presence. Collins plotted several emergency jump coordinates in case they needed to retreat quickly. Bell confirmed that all defensive systems were active and his security teams were ready for anything. The ship's armor was designed to withstand most known weapons, but the Devourers used technologies that humans had never encountered before. Bell hoped their defenses would be enough. Morrison took one last look at the tactical displays showing the massive Devourer swarm and made his final decision. The Vengeance would engage the enemy using every weapon at their disposal. Morrison opened a communication channel to the entire ship and announced that the battle was about to begin. Admiral Kresh watched in amazement as the human ship moved toward the Devourer swarm with no apparent fear or hesitation. The aliens had expected the humans to provide support or assistance. Instead, they were watching a single human ship prepare to attack an enemy that had destroyed most of the Zephyrian fleet. The first Devourer units detected the Vengeance when it came within scanning range of their formation. Morrison watched as thousands of mechanical units changed direction and began moving toward his ship. The machines moved with fluid precision that reminded him of a school of fish responding to a predator. The comparison was not comforting since in this case the humans were vastly outnumbered. Communications Officer Harris reported that the Devourers were sending signals to each other at frequencies that human equipment could barely detect. The AI machines were sharing information about the Vengeance faster than any biological species could process data. Harris estimated that every unit in the swarm would know about their presence within minutes. Chief Engineer Campbell brought the ship's reactors to full power and activated all defensive systems. The Vengeance's shields flickered to life, creating a barrier of energy around the hull. Campbell knew the shields would not stop the Devourers for long, but they might buy enough time to use the experimental weapons. Tactical Officer Grant watched as the Devourer formation began to change in response to their arrival. The machines were reorganizing themselves into attack patterns that seemed designed specifically to counter human ship design. Grant realized that the Devourers had been analyzing their transmissions and had learned about human technology in just a few minutes. Weapons Officer Parker locked onto the first target and prepared to fire the gravity manipulation cannon. The weapon required several seconds to charge and could only be fired once before needing to recharge. Parker chose her target carefully, knowing that she would not get a second chance if the first shot missed. Navigator Collins maintained the ship's position at the edge of the Devourer formation while monitoring escape routes. The machines were beginning to surround them, but Collins believed he could still get them out if the attack failed. Collins prepared to execute emergency maneuvers if the situation became desperate. Security Chief Bell watched his tactical displays as thousands of Devourer units moved toward the ship. Each machine was armed with cutting tools and energy weapons designed to break down matter at the atomic level. Bell hoped the ship's armor would protect them, but he had no idea how effective human defenses would be against Devourer weapons. Dr. Miller monitored the crew's vital signs and prepared for casualties. The medical bay was equipped with emergency, surgery equipment, and enough supplies to treat severe injuries. Miller hoped she would not need to use them, but she had seen what Devourer weapons could do to Zephyrian soldiers. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kresh and informed the Zephyrian commander that the humans were about to engage the enemy. Kresh responded with warnings about Devourer tactics and capabilities, but Morrison had already made his decision. The Vengeance would attack before the machines could complete their analysis of human technology. The first wave of Devourer units reached weapons range and began firing energy beams at the Vengeance. The ship's shields absorbed most of the incoming fire, but Campbell reported that power levels were dropping faster than expected. The Devourers seemed to be using weapons specifically designed to drain energy from their targets. Grant identified what appeared to be a weakness in the Devourer formation. The machines were concentrating their forces in the center of the swarm, but leaving the edges relatively undefended. Grant suggested attacking the flanks to avoid the heaviest concentration of enemy units. Parker fired the gravity manipulation cannon at the largest group of Devourers and watched as the weapon created a small artificial black hole in the middle of their formation. Hundreds of machines were pulled into the singularity and destroyed instantly. The remaining Devourers immediately changed their tactics to avoid the gravitational anomaly. Harris reported that the Devourers were communicating frantically among themselves as they tried to understand what had just happened to their units. The machines had never encountered weapons that could manipulate gravity and were struggling to develop countermeasures. Harris estimated that they had bought themselves several minutes before the Devourers adapted. Campbell began charging the exotic matter injectors while monitoring the ship's power levels. The gravity cannon had used enormous amounts of energy, and the reactors were operating at maximum capacity. Campbell warned Morrison that they could only fire the exotic matter weapons once before risking a reactor overload. Collins executed evasive maneuvers as more Devourer units attacked the ship. From multiple directions, the Vengeance's speed and agility allowed it to avoid most of the incoming fire, but several energy beams struck the hull, causing minor damage. Collins reported that the ship could withstand this level of attack for several more minutes. Bell coordinated damage control teams as they worked to repair systems damaged by Devourer weapons. The machines seemed to target specific ship systems rather than trying to destroy the entire vessel. Bell realized that the Devourers were trying to capture the ship intact so they could study human technology. Morrison watched as the Devourer swarm began to reorganize itself once again. The machines were learning from their encounter with the gravity weapon and developing new tactics. Morrison knew they had only minutes before the Devourers would be ready to counter anything else the humans could throw at them. Grant reported that the Devourers were forming a sphere around the Vengeance and closing in from all directions. The machines had abandoned their previous formations and were now using tactics specifically designed to trap the human ship. Grant estimated that they had less than 5 minutes before the trap would be complete. Parker prepared to fire the exotic matter injectors and warned everyone to brace for impact. The weapons would destabilize atomic bonds across a wide area and could potentially destroy thousands of Devourer units. Parker also warned that the weapons might damage the Vengeance if they were too close to the target area. Morrison made the decision to fire all remaining weapons simultaneously and then attempt to escape before the Devourers could respond. The attack would either destroy a significant portion of the enemy swarm or it would fail completely. Either way, the Vengeance would not get another chance to use surprise tactics against the machines. Parker fired all exotic matter injectors simultaneously, creating a chain reaction that spread through the Devourer formation like wildfire. The weapons destabilized atomic bonds, causing thousands of machines to simply fall apart at the molecular level. Morrison watched as entire sections of the enemy swarm disappeared in brilliant flashes of light as their matter converted to pure energy. The Devourers responded to this new threat faster than anyone had expected. The surviving machines immediately scattered in all directions, making it impossible for the humans to target large groups. Chief Engineer Campbell reported that the exotic matter weapons had used all remaining power reserves, and the ship was now running on emergency backup systems. Admiral Kresh watched from his flagship as the human ship continued fighting despite being surrounded by millions of enemy units. The Zephyrian commander had never seen anything like the weapons the humans were using. His tactical officers reported that the Vengeance had destroyed more Devourers in 10 minutes than the entire Zephyrian fleet had managed in 5 days of fighting. Communications Officer Harris detected new signals from the Devourer swarm indicating that the machines were calling for reinforcements from other parts of the star system. The main enemy force was still engaged in consuming the outer planets, but significant numbers of units were breaking off to deal with the human threat. Navigator Collins executed emergency maneuvers to avoid collision with Devourer units that were trying to ram the ship. The machines had abandoned energy weapons in favor of direct physical attacks designed to breach the hull. Collins used the ship's superior speed to stay ahead of the attackers, but fuel reserves were running low. Tactical Officer Grant reported that the Devourers were adapting their tactics faster than expected. The machines had already developed countermeasures against both the gravity weapon and the exotic matter injectors. Grant estimated that the same weapons would be much less effective if used again. Security Chief Bell coordinated damage control efforts as Devourer cutting beams penetrated the ship's outer armor in several locations. His teams worked frantically to seal breaches and prevent the machines from gaining access to the ship's interior. Bell reported that the hull could withstand this level of damage for perhaps another hour. Dr. Miller treated the first casualties of the battle as crew members were injured by exploding control panels and falling debris. The ship's medical bay was designed for treating injuries caused by conventional weapons, but Miller found herself dealing with energy burns unlike anything she had seen before. Morrison realized that conventional tactics would not work against an enemy that could adapt this quickly. The Devourers were learning from every attack and developing countermeasures faster than humans could change their strategy. Morrison decided to try something completely different that might catch the machines off guard. Campbell reported that the ship's main reactors were approaching critical overload due to the power demands of the experimental weapons. The engineer warned that another full-power weapons discharge might cause a reactor breach that would destroy the ship. Campbell began emergency procedures to stabilize the power systems. The Devourers launched coordinated attacks against specific ship systems in an apparent attempt to disable rather than destroy the Vengeance. Harris reported that the machines were targeting weapons, engines, and communication equipment while avoiding damage to the main hull. The enemy was clearly trying to capture the ship intact. Grant identified a new weakness in the Devourer formation as the machines concentrated their attacks on the human ship. The enemy units were clustering around the Vengeance, leaving other areas of the battlefield relatively undefended. Grant suggested using this tactical situation to their advantage. Parker attempted to recharge the gravity weapon, but discovered that the Devourers were now jamming the targeting systems. The machines had learned how the weapon worked and were using electromagnetic interference to prevent accurate targeting. Parker began working on manual targeting solutions that might bypass the jamming. Collins reported that enemy reinforcements were arriving from the outer system and would reach their position within minutes. The new Devourer units appeared to be larger and more heavily armed than the ones they had been fighting. Collins estimated that the ship would be completely overwhelmed once the reinforcements arrived. Bell received reports that Devourer cutting beams had penetrated to the inner hull in 3 locations. His security teams were preparing to repel boarders, but the machines had not yet attempted to enter the ship. Bell suspected that the Devourers were waiting for something before launching their final assault. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kresh and requested immediate assistance from any surviving Zephyrian ships. The alien commander responded that most of his fleet was trapped or destroyed, but a few ships might be able to provide covering fire. Kresh warned that Zephyrian weapons would have little effect against the Devourers. Campbell managed to stabilize the reactor systems, but reported that power output was severely reduced. The ship could maintain life support and basic defensive systems, but the experimental weapons would require several hours to recharge. Campbell estimated that they had enough power for one more major weapons discharge. Harris intercepted communications between Devourer units indicating that the machines were preparing for a final coordinated assault. The enemy had analyzed human defensive capabilities and developed tactics specifically designed to overwhelm their remaining systems. Harris estimated that the attack would begin within minutes. Grant completed her analysis of the tactical situation and presented Morrison with several options. They could attempt to fight their way out using conventional weapons, try to hide among the debris of destroyed planets, or make a desperate attack on the Devourer command structure. All options had very low chances of success. Morrison looked at his crew and realized that they had fought bravely against impossible odds. The Vengeance had inflicted more damage on the Devourers than anyone had thought possible, but they were still vastly outnumbered. Morrison prepared to make a decision that would determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone on the bridge, including his own officers. Instead of trying to escape or fight the approaching Devourer reinforcements, he ordered Navigator Collins to plot a course directly toward the system's star. The crew looked at their captain in shock, but Collins immediately began calculating the trajectory that would take them into the heart of the solar system. Chief Engineer Campbell understood what Morrison was planning and began making modifications to the ship's systems that would allow them to survive much closer to the star than any ship was designed to operate. Campbell worked frantically to boost the ship's heat shields and radiation protection, knowing that they would only have minutes to complete their mission once they reached the star. Admiral Kresh received Morrison's message explaining the human plan and could hardly believe what he was hearing. The humans intended to use the star itself as a weapon against the Devourers by triggering a controlled stellar flare. Kresh had never heard of such a tactic and doubted it was even possible with any known technology. Tactical Officer Grant began, calculating the precise positioning and timing required to create a directed stellar flare. The theory was sound, but had never been attempted in practice. Grant would need to coordinate the ship's remaining weapons with the star's natural magnetic field to channel the energy release toward the Devourer swarm. Weapons Officer Parker prepared the gravity manipulation cannon for one final shot that would need to be more precise than anything she had ever attempted. Parker would need to create a gravitational disturbance in the star's corona that would trigger a massive energy release. One mistake would either destroy the star completely or have no effect at all. Communications Officer Harris monitored Devourer communications as the machines detected the human ship's course change. The enemy seemed confused by this apparent retreat toward the star and were reorganizing their forces to intercept the Vengeance before it could escape the system. Security Chief Bell continued coordinating damage control efforts as the ship sustained more hits from pursuing Devourer units. The machines were following them toward the star but maintaining a safe distance from the stellar radiation. Bell realized that the Devourers had learned to fear the destructive power of stars from previous encounters. Dr. Miller prepared the medical bay for the extreme conditions they would face near the star. The ship's crew would be exposed to massive amounts of radiation, even with full shielding. Miller distributed radiation medicine to the entire crew and prepared treatments for radiation poisoning. Collins pushed the ship's engines to maximum power as they raced toward the star with thousands of Devourer units in pursuit. The machines were gaining on them slowly, but Collins calculated that they would reach optimal firing position before the enemy could intercept them. Collins also prepared emergency jump coordinates in case they needed to escape quickly after firing. Campbell reported that the ship's heat shields were already approaching their limits, and they were still millions of kilometers from the star. The engineer began venting atmosphere from non-essential compartments to reduce the heat load on the cooling systems. Campbell warned that they would only be able to maintain position near the star for a few minutes at most. Grant identified the optimal target point in the star's corona where a gravitational disturbance would have the maximum effect. The target was a region of unstable magnetic fields that could be triggered to release enormous amounts of energy in a directed beam. Grant calculated that the resulting stellar flare would be visible across the entire star system. Parker prepared to fire the gravity weapon at a star for the first time in human history. The targeting calculations were incredibly complex because the weapon would need to interact with magnetic fields and plasma flows that were constantly changing. Parker made final adjustments to her firing solution and reported ready to fire. Harris detected increased activity in the Devourer communications network as the machines realized what the humans were attempting. The enemy was frantically trying to calculate whether a stellar flare could actually reach their position and how much damage it might cause. Harris reported that some Devourer units were beginning to retreat from the inner system. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kresh and warned all Zephyrian ships to move to minimum safe distance from the star. The stellar flare would travel at the speed of light and would destroy anything in its path, including friendly forces. Morrison estimated that they had less than 1 hour before the flare would reach the outer planets. Bell reported that several Devourer cutting beams had penetrated to the ship's inner hull, but the machines were still not attempting to board. The enemy seemed more interested in disabling the ship than capturing it now that they understood what the humans were planning. Bell deployed all available personnel to critical damage control stations. Campbell brought the ship's remaining power systems online and prepared to channel everything into the gravity weapon. The engineer warned that firing the weapon this close to a star might cause feedback that could destroy their own ship. Campbell made peace with the possibility that this might be a suicide mission. Grant reported that they were approaching optimal firing position, but the window of opportunity would only last for a few minutes. The star's magnetic field configuration was constantly changing, and they needed to fire when conditions were exactly right. Grant began the final countdown to the firing sequence. Collins maintained the ship's position despite increasing solar radiation and gravitational stress. The Vengeance was closer to a star than any human ship had ever been, and the hull was beginning to show signs of heat damage. Collins reported that the engines were operating at maximum capacity just to maintain their current position. Parker locked onto her target in the star's corona and prepared to fire. The gravity weapon would create a small artificial black hole in the stellar atmosphere that would disrupt magnetic field lines and trigger a massive energy release. Parker had never been more nervous about pulling a trigger in her entire military career. Morrison looked at his crew and realized that they were about to attempt something that would either save the Zephyrian Empire or destroy everything in the star system, including themselves. Morrison gave the order to fire, knowing that there would be no second chances. Parker fired the gravity manipulation cannon directly into the star's corona, creating an artificial singularity that immediately began disrupting the stellar magnetic field. The effect was far more dramatic than anyone had expected, as massive loops of plasma began forming around the gravitational disturbance. Morrison watched in amazement as the star itself began to respond to their weapon. Chief Engineer Campbell monitored the ship's systems as they were battered by increasing solar radiation and gravitational waves from the disrupted star. The Vengeance's heat shields were failing and internal temperatures were rising beyond safe levels. Campbell began emergency cooling procedures while preparing to evacuate non-essential sections of the ship. The artificial black hole in the star's atmosphere grew larger as it consumed stellar plasma and magnetic field energy. Tactical Officer. Grant watched her calculations become reality as the star's natural fusion processes began to destabilize in the exact pattern she had predicted. Grant reported that the stellar flare would begin in less than 5 minutes. Navigator Collins fought to maintain the ship's position as gravitational anomalies from the disrupted star began affecting their orbit. The Vengeance was being pulled toward the stellar surface by fluctuating gravity fields while simultaneously being pushed away by increasing solar wind pressure. Collins used every trick he knew to keep them in optimal position. Communications Officer Harris reported that the Devourers had detected the changes in the star and were attempting to retreat to safe distance. The machines seemed to understand that something catastrophic was about to happen, but they were moving too slowly to escape the inner system. Harris estimated that most of the Devourer swarm would still be within range when the flare reached them. The star's surface began to show visible changes as magnetic field lines reorganized themselves around the artificial gravity well. Massive solar prominences erupted from the stellar surface, creating spectacular displays of energy that could be seen across the entire system. Dr. Miller watched the radiation monitors climb beyond maximum safe levels and distributed emergency medication to the crew. Security Chief Bell coordinated emergency procedures as ship systems began failing due to extreme heat and radiation exposure. The hull was glowing red-hot in some areas, and several compartments had to be evacuated when their life support systems failed. Bell moved all personnel to the most heavily shielded areas of the ship. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kresh and warned the Zephyrian commander that the stellar flare would begin within minutes. All ships needed to move behind the largest available planet or asteroid to avoid being destroyed by the energy release. Morrison also warned that the flare might last for several hours. Weapons Officer Parker watched her targeting displays as the artificial black hole continued to grow and consume more stellar material. The gravitational anomaly was creating exactly the kind of magnetic field disruption they needed, but it was also becoming increasingly unstable. Parker warned that the black hole might collapse unpredictably. Campbell reported that the ship's main power systems were approaching total failure due to electromagnetic interference from the disrupted star. The engineer was forced to shut down all non-essential systems and route emergency power to life support and navigation. Campbell estimated that they had perhaps 10 more minutes before total system failure. Grant monitored the star's magnetic field configuration and announced that the stellar flare was about to begin. The disrupted magnetic field lines were snapping back into alignment, creating a massive energy release that would be channeled directly toward the Devourer swarm. Grant reported that the flare would travel at light speed and reach the enemy in approximately 8 minutes. The star's surface erupted in a brilliant display of energy as magnetic field lines reconnected and released the power of millions of nuclear explosions. The stellar flare began as a narrow beam of concentrated plasma and radiation aimed directly at the area where the Devourer swarm was concentrated. Morrison had never seen anything so beautiful or terrifying in his entire life. Collins began emergency departure procedures as the stellar flare intensified and threatened to destroy their ship along with the enemy. The Vengeance needed to escape to minimum safe distance before the secondary effects of the flare could reach them. Collins plotted a course that would take them behind the largest planet in the system. Harris intercepted frantic communications from the Devourer swarm as the machines realized they could not escape the approaching energy wave. The enemy was attempting to coordinate defensive measures, but their technology was not designed to survive exposure to stellar plasma traveling at near light speed. Harris reported that most Devourer units were simply shutting down their communications. Belt coordinated damage control efforts as the ship's hull began to buckle under extreme thermal stress. Several sections of the outer armor had melted completely, and the inner hull was showing signs of structural failure. Bell worked with Campbell to identify which systems were absolutely critical for survival. Morrison watched the tactical displays as the stellar flare spread across the inner star system like a wave of destruction. The energy beam was so intense that it was visible against the background of space itself. Morrison realized that they had created the most powerful weapon in galactic history, using nothing but the star's own energy. Parker reported that the artificial black hole was beginning to collapse as it consumed all available matter in the immediate area. The collapse would create additional gravitational waves that might trigger secondary stellar eruptions. Parker recommended immediate retreat to avoid being caught in any additional energy releases. Campbell announced that the ship's engines were at maximum power and ready for emergency departure. The engineer warned that they would need to jump to hyperspace within the next few minutes or risk being destroyed by their own weapon. Campbell had never been more proud or terrified of human engineering capabilities. Grant calculated that the stellar flare would reach the main Devourer concentration in less than 2 minutes. The energy release contained more power than the total energy output of most civilizations over their entire history. Grant realized that they had just demonstrated that humans could weaponize stars themselves. Morrison gave the order to retreat as the stellar flare continued to intensify and spread across the system. The Vengeance had accomplished something that no other species had ever attempted and survived to tell about it. Morrison wondered what the rest of the galaxy would think when they learned that humans could turn stars into weapons. The stellar flare reached the Devourer swarm exactly 8 minutes after it began traveling at the speed of light across the star system. Morrison and his crew watched from behind the shelter of a gas giant as the energy wave struck the mechanical army with the concentrated power of their own star. The effect was immediate and absolute, as billions of Devourer units simply ceased to exist under the assault of stellar plasma. Admiral Kresh observed the destruction of his ancient enemy from his flagship and could hardly believe what he was seeing. The machines that had terrorized the galaxy for thousands of years were being destroyed faster than his sensors could track. Within minutes, the entire Devourer swarm had been reduced to scattered debris drifting through space. Chief Engineer Campbell brought the ship's systems back online as they emerged from behind the planet and surveyed the battlefield. The Vengeance had sustained severe damage from their close approach to the star, but all critical systems were still functioning. Campbell began assessing what repairs would be needed to get them safely back to Earth. Communications Officer Harris established contact with surviving Zephyrian ships and began coordinating rescue operations for any remaining Devourer victims. The stellar flare had not only destroyed the mechanical swarm, but had also sterilized several planets that the machines had partially consumed. Harris estimated that it would take years to fully assess the damage. Navigator Collins plotted a course back to the main Zephyrian fleet while monitoring for any surviving Devourer units. The stellar flare had been so intense that it was unlikely anything mechanical could have survived, but Collins maintained full sensor sweeps to be certain. Collins reported that the system appeared to be completely clear of enemy forces. Tactical. Officer Grant analyzed the effectiveness of their improvised stellar weapon and began writing reports that would revolutionize human military doctrine. The ability to weaponize stars meant that humans could potentially defend against any threat, no matter how large or technologically advanced. Grant realized that they had just changed the balance of power in the galaxy. Dr. Miller treated crew, members who had been injured by radiation exposure and heat damage during their close approach to the star. The medical bay was filled with personnel suffering from various degrees of radiation poisoning, but Miller was confident that everyone would make a full recovery. Miller also began studying the long-term effects of stellar radiation on human physiology. Security. Chief Bell coordinated repair efforts throughout the ship as damage control teams worked to restore systems that had been damaged by extreme heat and electromagnetic interference. The hull would need extensive repairs before the ship could safely return to human space, but Bell was confident that they could make the necessary temporary fixes. Morrison opened a communication channel to Admiral Kresh and formally announced that the Devourer threat had been eliminated. The Zephyrian commander responded with gratitude and amazement that seemed genuine despite the language barrier. Kresh requested permission to send engineering teams to study the Vengeance and learn how humans had accomplished this impossible victory. Weapons Officer Parker began developing training protocols for the stellar flare technique so that other human ships could replicate their success if necessary. Parker realized that the weapon was so powerful that it should only be used in the most desperate circumstances. Parker also began working on safety procedures to prevent accidental stellar disruption. Harris intercepted communications from across the galaxy as news of the Devourer defeat spread to other civilizations. Species that had lived in fear of the machines for centuries were celebrating, while others were reassessing their opinions of human military capabilities. Harris reported that several alien governments were requesting immediate diplomatic contact with Earth. Campbell completed his damage assessment and reported that the Vengeance could safely return to human space with temporary repairs. The ship's experimental weapons had performed beyond all expectations, but had also pushed human technology to its absolute limits. Campbell recommended extensive modifications before attempting similar missions in the future. Grant received tactical data from Admiral Kresh about other Devourer infestations in distant parts of the galaxy. The machines had been operating in at least 17 other star systems and were threatening several more civilizations. Grant began planning how human forces could respond to these additional threats using their new stellar weapon techniques. Morrison realized that the mission had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but had also created new responsibilities for humanity. The ability to destroy entire star systems meant that other species would either fear or worship human military power. Morrison began drafting reports for Earth Command about the diplomatic implications of their victory. Bell reported that all crew members were accounted for and that morale was extremely high despite the extensive ship damage. The crew of the Vengeance had just participated in the most significant military victory in galactic history, and they knew it. Bell recommended commendations for everyone who had participated in the mission. Collins confirmed that hyperspace engines were operational and that they could depart for Earth whenever Morrison gave the order. The return journey would take longer than usual due to damaged navigation systems, but Collins was confident they could reach human space safely. Collins also plotted routes to the other Devourer-infected systems in case Earth Command decided to launch additional missions. Dr. Miller completed her medical examinations and declared that all crew members were fit for duty, despite their radiation exposure. The advanced medical technology aboard the Vengeance had prevented any serious long-term health effects. Miller recommended regular medical monitoring for the crew, but expected no lasting problems. Harris established communication with Earth Command and transmitted preliminary mission reports along with tactical data about the stellar weapon technique. The response from human leadership was immediate interest in deploying additional ships equipped with similar weapons to deal with the remaining Devourer threats across the galaxy. Morrison looked at his crew and realized that they had just begun, a new chapter in human history. The Vengeance had proven that human ingenuity and determination could overcome any threat, no matter how impossible it seemed. Morrison gave the order to depart for Earth, knowing that they would return to the galaxy as its newest protectors.